public hearing of the Senate Communications and Technology Committee to order. I want to thank all of the members, our testifiers who could join us here today. And today's hearing is to receive feedback from key stakeholders on how Pennsylvania best deploys 5G wireless technology. Expanding access to 5G is one of the many ways Pennsylvania can address improving access to high-speed internet to communities all across the Commonwealth. This is part of a broader solution. However, what we have seen is that 5G deployment in Pennsylvania greatly lags what we are seeing in many other states, including states that border the Commonwealth. Today's discussion starts that process, and while my goal was to have all of the stakeholders testify in one hearing so we can resolve this issue sooner rather than later, we will convene a second public hearing on this topic on Monday, May 10th at 10:30 a.m. I appreciate those groups who were ready to discuss this matter today, and I look forward to this discussion on ways we can improve how 5G is deployed in Pennsylvania. And with that being said, I want to turn it over to my friend and Democratic Chair of the committee, Senator Kaine. Senator Kaine, thank you very much.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you for all the work on today's committee's hearing and your continued partnership over the past several months. Thank you. The past year has been challenging for all of us and has made clear the extent of the inequities in our communities. One of these, and one that has been essential in the past year, is access to technology and the importance of bridging the digital divide in unserved and underserved communities here in Pennsylvania. Expanding 5G is critical for supporting these underserved, but we need to make sure all the stakeholders have a voice at the table. Today, we'll be hearing from local governments to ensure new infrastructure installments comply with their zoning and property rights. We'll be hearing from carriers and wireless providers about how to expand access to wireless and 5G. And next week, we'll be hearing from labor and executive agencies about the impact of the bill on Pennsylvanian communities and Pennsylvania's workforce. The hearing on May 10th is the first time that the Pennsylvania union workers will be who will be the ones putting the new infrastructure into place, will have a seat at the table. Expanding our 5G usage presents an opportunity to provide good-paying, family-sustaining union jobs and increase equity for workers while serving underserved communities. And while our labor leaders aren't testifying today, I want everyone to know that I will make sure our workers always have a voice in these conversations and that our plans support working people and working families. Expanding 5G has the potential to be good for our local governments, good for our communities, and good for our workers. But we have to make sure we do it right. This hearing is our opportunity to hear from everyone who will be involved in this process, to make sure that our plans don't leave anyone behind. I want to thank all of our testifiers for being here today, and I look forward to hearing your perspective and working with you moving forward. So thank you.
Thank you, Chairman Kaine. And I want to welcome our first panel of wireless providers. Beth Ann Cooley, who is the Assistant Vice President of State Legislative Affairs with the CTIA. Arturo Chang, who is Senior Counsel for State Government Affairs with the Wireless Infrastructure Association. And Ashley Henry Shook, who is the spokesperson for the PA Partnership for 5G. Welcome to you all, and please begin when you are ready.
Thank you, Madam Chair and members of the committee. My name is Beth Cooley. I am the Assistant Vice President of State Legislative Affairs at CTIA. CTIA is the trade association for the wireless communications industry. Now, I do have a PowerPoint to share. Madam Chair, should I just share my screen? Would you like me to do that?
I am very sorry, but with the format that we use here on the floor of the Senate, we are not going to be able to have screen sharing. But if you can provide that presentation to me, I will make it available to all of the committee members.
Great, thank you. And
Thank you.
Thank you, Madam Chair. You should have a copy of that, so I'll just provide some brief remarks if that's okay.
That would be wonderful. Thank you very much.
Great. So a little bit about CTIA. You know, we are the trade association for the wireless carriers, handset manufacturers, as well as suppliers and app companies. If you'd like more information about CTIA, I'd encourage you to take a look at ctia.org. Before diving in, discussing 5G, the next generation of enhanced wireless services, I thought it would be helpful to just level set on the prevalence of wireless in Pennsylvania. It should come as no surprise that there are more wireless devices than there are people in the United States, and the same can be said for Pennsylvania. With over 13 million wireless connections and over 40% of households being wireless only, wireless plays an integral role in Pennsylvanians' lives. Further, the wireless industry contributes over $16 billion annually to Pennsylvania's GDP and employs over 102,000 people. And these are good paying jobs, by paying over 90% more according to the Bureau of Labor Statistics. So having discussed wireless contributions, I thought it would be beneficial to highlight what folks are using their wireless devices for. While of course you can still make phone calls with your device, the demand for mobile data has proved insatiable in recent years. In the PowerPoint presentation that you will take a look at, there is a graph in there that comes from CTIA's annual wireless survey. In 2019, 96 times more mobile data was used than in 2010, at over 37 trillion megabytes of data. So what is 37 trillion megabytes of data? You know, what does that look like? To put that into perspective, that is the equivalent of the entire population of Chicago watching The Last Dance over 1,600 times each, and that's a lot of data. It's important to note that CTIA's 2019 survey doesn't include the data traffic surge that we saw on networks nearly overnight due to COVID. During COVID, we saw an increase of over 43% in voice traffic and nearly 20% increase in data traffic. COVID has clearly highlighted how important reliable connectivity is, and the fact that this hearing is remote speaks to that. So this is where 5G comes into play. To accommodate our insatiable demand for mobile data, connectivity will be enhanced even further with 5G. 5G networks will be 5 times as responsive as today's 4G networks, which means that the latency or the time between data sending and receiving will be reduced by 5 times, which makes 5G especially well suited for mission critical communications in areas like telemedicine, public safety, and first response. 5G will also serve up to 100 times more devices, which means that the Internet of Things, or IoT, can connect a vast array of previously unconnected objects, from streetlights, trash cans, parking meters, crops. And finally, what you probably hear the most about is that 5G will be up to 100 times faster than today's 4G networks, which makes it a great backbone for bandwidth-intensive technologies like AR, VR, and high-resolution images and videos. It's also important to note that there are enormous economic benefits to both states and localities that they will experience due to 5G deployments. A recent Boston Consulting Group report estimates that over the next decade, 5G deployments will contribute $1.5 trillion to the US GDP and create 4.5 million jobs. To localize that for Pennsylvania, over the next decade, over 126,000 jobs will be created and over 45 billion contributed to the Commonwealth's GDP. Now, I want to be respectful of everyone's time as we talk about 5G, but we could truly spend hours talking about some of the benefits that 5G will bring, often called the fourth industrial revolution. every industry, including healthcare, energy, transportation, law enforcement, e-commerce, logistics, will all be positively impacted by 5G. And that's the power of 5G. It will touch every facet of our lives, enabling us to be safer, think smarter, and react quicker. Just a few sectors I would highlight. Again, I want to be respectful of everyone's time. But one area is smart communities or smart cities. Wireless-powered smart city solutions will deliver $160 billion in benefits and savings through things like lower energy use and less congestion. Sensors will also monitor the health of critical infrastructure like buildings, roads, and bridges, while connected trash cans, bus stops, light poles, and more will help cities operate more efficiently. In education, nearly overnight, everyone had to move to remote work and remote learning. 5G will give students expanded opportunities to learn through immersive applications such as virtual reality VR and augmented reality AR, thanks to the lower latency that I mentioned about 5G. So having highlighted just a few of the silos impacted by 5G begs the question, how do we get there? What type of infrastructure and policies do we need in place? And I think that's sort of the meat and potatoes of what we're here to talk about today. In order to provide 5G, we need the proper wireless infrastructure in place. Small cells are often synonymous with 5G, and I do have some pictures in my PowerPoint that you can take a look at after the fact to see what these small cells actually look like. And they are synonymous with 5G, and that's true, but it's important to remember that those 200-foot tall macro towers you see along the side of the highway, they will also be able to provide 5G services, just on different licensed spectrum. And a little bit more on small cells, they're about the size of a backpack or a pizza box, and they can be placed on traffic signals or street lights, and they're able to handle more data that I mentioned today and the 5G services of tomorrow. It's important to remember that small cells can do double duty. They're an important building block of 5G, but they're also being deployed today on our 4G networks to accommodate that explosive mobile data usage I previously mentioned and to reduce congestion on wireless networks. So while small cells can be installed in as little as an hour or two, often outdated rules designed for those 200-foot tall macro towers could mean it could cost thousands of dollars in fees and more than a year to deploy just one simple small cell. In other words, because small cells are relatively new technology, oftentimes the statutes have not kept pace. So in the absence of updating these statutes, small cells could be treated like those 200-foot tall towers, thus slowing down the rollout of 5G and threatening America's continued wireless leadership. I had previously mentioned a report from the Boston Consulting Group, and they actually found that a 6-month delay in network deployment could cost about $25 billion in lost benefits over 10 years. So, the advocacy and the principles, the core principles that we're going to talk about today as a panel, really come down to 3 key issues. And that's reasonable access to government-owned property, like municipal facilities and public rights of way. Reasonable and non-discriminatory fees, reflecting municipalities' direct management costs. We recognize that we're accessing the public rights of way, and we want to reimburse localities for any actual costs they incur from processing permits, applications, etc. And modernized processes, providing reasonable timelines, more uniform approaches, and objective standards. And finally, you'll see in my PowerPoint, I do have a map of the country, which shows that the notion of updating rules to reflect new technology is not a radical idea. In fact, to date, 31 states and Puerto Rico have enacted legislation to streamline the deployment of small cells by providing that regulatory certainty with shot clocks and processes, reasonable fees, and reasonable access. So in closing, a little bit about Pennsylvania, and I will lean on my local members to provide some context as well. Small cell legislation is needed in Pennsylvania. It works, it's working in the other states, and the legislation streamlines the approval for small cells. It establishes predictability and certainty through shot clocks or timelines and fee levels. There is an industry agreement with the 4 municipal associations in the Commonwealth, And this agreement builds on existing federal law. That is the law of the land today. And as with any negotiation, the industry did not get everything that we wanted, but the agreement does meet those core principles that I previously mentioned, and they have been addressed. So thank you so much for your time today, Madam Chair, committee members. And if there are any questions, we are happy to take them, and we look forward to continue working with you. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Coley. And if we could, would like to reserve questions until the end of the panel. Really appreciate your testimony. Now, if we could welcome Arturo Chang, Senior Counsel for State Government Affairs for the Wireless Infrastructure Association. Mr. Chang.
Thank you. Thank you. Good afternoon, Madam Chair and members of the committee. Thank you for scheduling and hearing on this very important issue for the Commonwealth. My name is Arturo Chang, and I'm here to express our strong support for the latest agreement between the industry and the municipal associations that will modernize Pennsylvania's processes to expedite small cell deployment, increasing wireless connectivity, and pave the way to the many benefits and services that Ms. Cooley just covered. A little bit more about WIA. The Wireless Infrastructure Association is a principal trade association that represents the businesses that build, develop, own, and operate the wireless infrastructure in Pennsylvania and throughout the US. So about this agreement. This agreement represents a balanced approach that encourages deployment of small cell infrastructure in a responsible and sustainable way, while ensuring that localities retain the necessary authority to regulate the continuity of structures being built in the public right-of-way. A statewide approach provides greater predictability that will encourage private investment in this next generation networks. And as we have talked about before, 31 other states and Puerto Rico have adopted an approach similar to this agreement. Pennsylvania consumers rely on wireless networks and are dependent on being connected in their everyday lives, but things are different today. The COVID pandemic has put a tremendous demand for wireless services. In addition, activities such as working from home, virtual meetings such as the one we're having right now, remote or distance learning for our children, and telehealth are now prevalent, and they all rely on wireless connectivity, which is anchored first and foremost on wireless infrastructure to operate properly. But I'm here to also talk about another important factor, and that is jobs. We will need workers to install this new equipment, to operate it, and to continue maintaining these important wireless networks. And I'm so proud to say that WIA is deeply committed to this important issue. In fact, WIA is the national sponsor of the Telecommunications Industry Register Apprenticeship Program, or TIRAP, apologize for the long acronym there, which is a Department of Labor register program, which has established defined career paths in a growing number of critical occupations, including wireless technicians and installers in the telecommunications industry. WIA is leading in workforce development for the telecommunications industry with a focus on underrepresented populations, including veterans, women, and people of color. WIA also maintains the Telecommunications Education Center, or TEC, a dynamic learning program devoted to improving education, quality of work, safety standards, and other important issues in the telecommunications industry. I'm going to keep my testimony short, but I just want to say that on a personal note, I have worked with many of the present stakeholders present in this meeting and outside in Harrisburg for over 4 years. Back then in 2017, only 11 states had enacted small cell legislation, and now 20 additional states have enacted a small cell bill, availing themselves to the investment and benefits that we're discussing right now. Similar legislation is also being considered in New York and my home state of New Jersey, and other states are also exploring it. The fact is that the time is ripe for Pennsylvania and the Commonwealth to have a comprehensive approach to small wireless facilities that make sense. Thank you again, Madam Chair and members of the committee, for holding this very important hearing, and I'm happy to answer any questions.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chang. And I'd now like to welcome Ashley Henry Shook, who is the spokesperson for the PA Partnership for 5G. Ms. Shook.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair. The Pennsylvania Partnership for 5G is a business and technology education and advocacy group supporting the deployment of 5G technology infrastructure throughout the Commonwealth. The Pennsylvania Partnership for 5G represents nearly 60 organizations across a broad spectrum of industries throughout the state. And I wanted to just outline a few of them today because they do represent such a diverse pool of organizations. Our members include the Pennsylvania Chamber of Business and Industry, the Philadelphia Fraternal Order of Police, the Pittsburgh Technology Council, the Pocono Mountains Visitors Bureau, Robert Morris University, Gateway Health, UPMC, and Highmark Health, just to name a few. A full membership listing is attached to our testimony, and I hope you will review it at your leisure. Over the past year, I have had the pleasure of meeting with many of you or your staff to talk about why this topic is so incredibly timely. The pandemic has certainly illuminated the importance of connectivity. After all, we're learning from home, we're working remotely, telemedicine visits have been normalized, online portals continue to be used to secure vaccination appointments. Despite this collective recognition that connectivity matters to every household, every student, every business across the Commonwealth, Pennsylvania has yet to tap into the truly transformative power of 5G, primarily because we haven't advanced a legislative framework to fully deploy the infrastructure that will support 5G networks. The delay in securing ubiquitous 5G access for Pennsylvania consumers is due in part to inaction in adopting statewide small cell legislation. Cell towers, fiber, and small cell nodes work together to create an ecosystem of connectivity, with small cells creating the backbone for 5G, the fifth generation of mobile networks. The innovative potential of 5G is not only expected to be a boon for economic development, which I'm going to talk about in just one second. It will also support a whole host of technological advancements, including remote surgery and patient monitoring, robotic deliveries, precision agriculture, autonomous vehicles, and various smart city applications. So why do small cells impact economic development? Because businesses and developers and parents and healthcare facilities and entertainment venues, they all want to be located where they have wireless coverage and wireless capacity, and small cells do both. They provide coverage in rural areas, and they provide capacity in dense urban areas where networks are already strained due to the number of new devices that continue to come online every day. In the absence of statewide legislation, each individual municipality has established its own process for small cell deployment. With over 2,500 municipalities in Pennsylvania, there's a different process, time frame, cost associated with how this infrastructure is getting deployed across the state. As a result, it's costing time and it's costing money. So let's talk about time first. According to our members, it can take any single Pennsylvania municipality an average of 6 months to approve a small cell permit. If it took you 6 months to secure a permit for a home improvement project, how much costlier of a project would it become? How likely would you be to just abandon the idea or change up your plans completely? With continued inaction on small cell legislation, we're also losing out on the $275 billion in private investment that is currently up for grabs. As we've stated, 31 other states have already enacted statewide small cell legislation, which means they've created a regulatory environment that's predictable, that's uniform, that's consistent. And it's why more than 70% of 5G deployments are occurring in states where legislation has already been enacted, including neighboring states like Ohio and West Virginia and Delaware. And what's similarly compelling is that these states have passed small cell legislation in an overwhelmingly bipartisan fashion. I'd encourage you to review the map that is attached to this testimony that shows which states have adopted legislation to date, and the corresponding vote tallies for each state across both legislative chambers. Those are the states that are experiencing rapid small cell deployment and the associated build out of 5G networks. That's spurring economic development, that's spurring innovation. Now, while I may be part of the industry panel today, the Pennsylvania Partnership for 5G doesn't represent telecommunications alone. In fact, we represent every other industry that makes Pennsylvania successful, from healthcare to education, from agriculture to tourism. I'm here representing those industries, and those industries agree they need 5G, especially as we all strive to meet the evolving demands of an increasingly digitized world. So we extend a standing invitation to each of you to meet with our members and discuss why this legislation is so critical for them and also for the state's economic viability. So on behalf of our members, I urge you to move swiftly and introduce and adopt small cell legislation. Thank you very much for your time and attention today.
Thank you very much. Appreciate all of your testimony. 75% of deployment of small cells is occurring in states with small cell legislation. I have heard numbers, with great numbers of small cells being deployed in Ohio, in one city alone, far exceeding what's being deployed across the entire Commonwealth. Can any of you tell me how many small cells are being deployed in states that have small cell legislation in place, like we are discussing, compared to Pennsylvania?
Madam Chair, Beth Cooley, CTIA. I'll take a stab at that. You know, as a trade association, we are not able to know about the future deployments of our members. I do have to just say that. But what we can say is that post-state small cell passage and FCC order, which we haven't talked much about, that investment has increased across the country post those two actions. And so, in other words, our members, my members, are investing more. Just in 2019, they invested $29.1 billion, which is a 4-year high. So what that says is that regulatory certainty, like statewide small cell legislation, incents investment. So not quite on the mark in terms of how many numbers of small cells, but I can tell you that investment has increased, and the national data supports that, if that helps.
Well, and I thank you. If you can access specific numbers, I think it would be very helpful to make the case. You know, we worked with local telehealth providers and learned that in 2019, they were doing in total a small fraction of what they were doing every day. I believe it was 179 telehealth visits for one of our healthcare entities in an entire year, and they were then, during the pandemic, doing 179 visits a day. So those numbers really help to make the case, and if you can access those and share them, would really appreciate it. A lot of conversation about jobs being created. I believe the number was 126,500 jobs. Would we expect that this legislation would create more opportunities for labor? And can you detail what that has looked like in other states with small cell legislation?
Madam Chair, this is Frank Buzadlowski from Verizon. I'll take a stab at that one, if I may. Passing this bill would put Pennsylvania on a level playing field with those 31 other states that have already been referenced as having enacted these types of laws. Because what it'll do is it'll attract more capital spending for us to deploy more small cells, and that will provide more man hours. And in Verizon's case, that'll be CWA represented linemen and splicers who install the Verizon Pennsylvania fiber optic lines to the small cells. And in addition to the Communications Workers of America represented people at Verizon Pennsylvania, The Verizon Wireless contractors, their IBEW represented workers will also get more man hours, and the old expression, a rising tide floats all boats. So we would see more deployment driving more jobs. And I'd also like to point out, if I may, that in Delaware, which enacted this 3 years ago, there was no opposition from the CWA, and that's the same union that represents the Verizon workers in Pennsylvania. And in Delaware, we've seen our deployment jump very, very significantly. And also New Jersey was, or at least bordering states were mentioned a few minutes ago. In New Jersey, it's looking like their Senate is going to pass this legislation in May. And of interest, the IBEW, which is the primary Verizon union in New Jersey, the equivalent of CWA in Pennsylvania, has gone on record. On March 17th, they sent a written slip of support for the legislation.
Thank you, Mr. Buzzetlowski. If you could quantify the specific number of jobs pre and post, or an increase to show that percentage increase that you experienced in Delaware. Obviously, New Jersey has not enacted their legislation yet. I think that would be very helpful for the members of the committee as we continue our work. How much of a detriment is it that certain municipalities can charge over 10 times the Federal Communication Commission's suggested rate to site a small cell? My understanding is that on average, that fee is $270, but there are municipalities in Pennsylvania that far exceed that number. Can you talk about the challenges that presents, and if you find that to be a detriment to the deployment of small cells in Pennsylvania?
Madam Chair, I guess I'll take that one. Any of my colleagues, feel free to jump in. But what I will say is that to the extent that a locality is charging more than the reasonable presumption of rates in the FCC state and local order, that is resources and investment that is now being sucked out of a particular company. So these capital budgets are made up to 5 years in advance on where the members want to build out. And so to the extent that they have to expend resources and limited capital to deploy small cells where the congestion needs immediately are, that's less resources and capital that could be going to update a macro tower, for example, or build a new site. So I've actually been working on this issue for about 5 years now, and I've heard my members publicly say that in a state that did not have small cell legislation, it was easier to deploy in other states, and they sent their money to another state. And it's just money that is not coming and being invested in your communities. So I hope that helps answer your question.
That's very helpful.
Madam Chair?
Yes?
I just wanted to add a couple of points to Beth's answer, because it's not only the fees, but it's also the process, right? It goes together, right? So the bill will modernize both the fees, but also provide a predictable process so that all parties know when to expect an answer to an application. And I just wanted to add to Beth's point. I've been in public hearings just like this one, where members of the industry have flat out told legislators that we're so busy deploying in other states where there is a small cell bill that I almost have such limited bandwidth to come to a state where the fees are everywhere and the process is so unpredictable. So that's also something to keep in mind for Pennsylvania.
Thank you very much. Senator Dush.
Thank you, Chairwoman. Understandable, we came over from the House together. You guys have brought up a great question here. How much have we lost in Pennsylvania by not having this this type of a bill in place now? How much infrastructure and what's the cost to, especially like in rural Pennsylvania where we've we're lacking internet altogether. So if you could address that, and how much, has anybody tracked that, quantified it?
I'll take a stab at it. Good afternoon, Senator. Tom Musgrove, Government Affairs Manager with Crown Castle. Just to give you kind of an example of a project that we had started in 2018, we essentially had about 200 small cells to build across Western Pennsylvania. So think Washington County pretty much up to Center County. So we're kind of covering, it wasn't just, the metro area, it's kind of a little bit of everywhere. And in the time it took us to build it, it took about 2 years. We had not permitted everything. And eventually the job dried up. So we lost about 40 small cells in that opportunity because of the challenges with municipal zoning. Ashley pointed out a comment earlier that, it took on average 6 months to site a small cell. Well, that's the average. We saw some municipalities do a great job, turn around permits in weeks, but then we saw some that took well over a year, almost even up to 2 years. So, I think what you see is carriers, Crown Castle, et cetera, as we look to allocate capital, when you spent 2 years working on siting a single small cell, you say, hey, it may just be easier to go over to this next state where I can predict how long it's going to take me to get it, and I know it's going to cost me.
Have any of you had any similar experiences? Well, thank you, Chairman. Appreciate the opportunity.
Thank you, Senator Dash. Chairman Kane.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I do have a question for each one of the panelists, and thank you so much for your comments today. But Ms. Cooley, in your testimony, you showed the new jobs and GDP growth for metro areas in Pennsylvania. What is the job and the GDP growth numbers for rural areas in Pennsylvania? Did you know that?
Thank you for your question, Senator. I do not. I could certainly look into that. I've just pulled some discrete areas, but I could certainly follow up with you, Senator.
Great, thank you. I appreciate that. I do have a question for Mr. Chang. Could you please talk a little bit more about the TRAP program to train wireless technicians and installers? I would like to know how many people have completed this program, if you know that number. How many people are currently employed from the program? What is the average wage? And if these workers are union members, would you be able to answer that for me, please?
Thank you for the question. I don't have those specific numbers I can get back to you, but I can tell you a little bit more about TIRAP. It's a national program. We partner with employers that are looking to fill these positions, and these are unique qualified positions, as you can imagine, and we train those incoming employers into the basics of what they need to know for these jobs, and then the employers hire them. So we are training the workforce, and sometimes we say the workforce of tomorrow, but really it's the workforce of today. We need these employees, these trained individuals today. But I would be happy to go back and take a look at our numbers. And again, I just wanted to thank you for your time.
Thank you. And I have one for Ms. Shook. You mentioned in your testimony at the bottom of page 1 that small cells providers coverage in rural areas. Equity and access to 5G is very important to me. Please tell the committee what rural areas in Pennsylvania currently have small cell deployment, and what language in the current draft of the 5G deployment will guarantee that small cell will be deployed to the rural areas.
Thank you for your question, sir.
Yeah, I'd be happy to. All right, so go ahead.
Thank you. And I'd be happy to rope in some of my peers on the line today to talk about their specific deployments. As Tom Musgrove just articulated, the example that he cited stretched from Washington County up to Center County, which included some very rural parts of the state. And there are small cells, not just in urban environments in Pennsylvania, there are small cells throughout the state. So I don't know if there are any carriers on the phone, or Tom, if you want to talk about other specific examples of rural deployments.
This is Frank Bozaglowski. The two off the top of my head for Verizon Wireless are Chambersburg and Gettysburg. I know we have significant deployments there, and I can look through my documents, see if I'll find some more examples. Well, maybe some others can chime in.
Great, thank you.
Senator, it's Dave Kerr, President External Affairs for AT&T, and I also want to jump in on this question as well. And I want to be very clear. We've made some deployments in rural areas of Pennsylvania. Of course, the definition of rural can always be a challenge, but in many very rural areas of Pennsylvania. But I want to be abundantly clear too that this is not, small cells are not a rural broadband solution. I don't think any of us are really saying that. Our deployments in rural areas, think of more downtown areas, maybe areas where there's like a university or a large presence of activity like university research and things like that in rural areas. So if you characterize that as rural deployment, certainly our company, our competitors across the board are making those deployments and would like to do more of those deployments in rural areas that this bill would bring about. But I just want to make sure we understand this is not like a rural broadband, completely unserved area type solution for the most part.
Thank you. No further questions.
Thank you, Chairman Kane. If I could, you have all been working on suggestions for legislation that would work here in the Commonwealth. Have you been working with the association that represent the myriad of different municipalities that we have across the Commonwealth? Have they provided you suggestions, input on what they would like to see in terms of legislation?
Madam Chair, Dave Kerr again, I'll take a stab at that and certainly defer to my counterparts on the panel. We began having discussions probably over 3 years ago now with the variety of the municipal associations, which you'll hear from here momentarily. These discussions have been very intense, quite frankly. The negotiations have been very intense. There's been 2 previous iterations of this bill that have been introduced over in the House, your colleagues on the House side. These bills have changed dramatically from where they were, certainly from the first iteration to the second, and then to this agreement that we referenced today. It's really significant changes. So it's been an intense negotiation and the way the political process, quite frankly, should work. So we very much, and obviously you can address questions to our peers at the municipal level on the next panel.
Very good, thank you. And similarly, have the labor groups been worked with? Have they provided suggestions or input in what they would like to see in this legislation?
And Madam Chair, we've had some discussions with labor as well. Again, back two or three years ago. What we saw in writing at the time back then from labor were primarily municipal issues, which we hope we've addressed with this recent agreement that we've mentioned here and referenced here. So haven't had as many discussions with them on substance lately. We're certainly willing to do that. And based on what you'd said at the top of the hearing in terms of getting feedback from them and in a stakeholder process and a hearing process, we very much look forward to hearing from them and addressing any issues that our labor would raise specific to this bill.
Very good. I know that there have been some concerns with labor. We will be hearing from the municipal organizations after this panel and then from labor on May 10th. But can you speak to any grievances that have been filed by unions against providers regarding small cell installations? Do you track that? And is that something that you can share with us?
Madam Chair, Frank Bozaglowski, Verizon. In preparation for this meeting, I did check on that, and there are no open grievances by the CWA. And we went back a few years, and we had to actually go back to 2018 before we could find one grievance. And that one it was to ask that the CWA represented employees do additional wiring. In other words, they wanted more work So they would go further up the pole to connect to the terminal that connects to electric and to the small cell ultimately. So it would be extending fiber up the pole. So that was a grievance that was in 2018. That was arbitrated and determined that CWA did not get that work under the collective bargaining agreement. So when Verizon Wireless uses a contractor, it would be an that's IBEW represented, it would be their people that do that work. But that was it. That was all that we had.
Thank you. Can any of the other providers speak to that issue?
I'm not aware of any, Madam Chair.
Very good. Thank you. Mr. Chang, you discussed 31 states have some sort of legislation in place. Could you elaborate a little bit more about how the process went in those other states?
Thank you for the question, Madam Chair. The process in the other states was very similar to what you're seeing. The industry is engaging with communities and localities and associations to reach an agreement on the language that makes sense. And that's important to us. You know, cities and we are part of the community as much as any other member of the industry, and we want to work together on that. And in many states, including Georgia and South Carolina, for example, those associations have actually supported the small cell bill. So it's been collaborative. It hasn't taken 4 years, but we have reached agreement. We have, again, like I said, 31 states. And I think Ashley made an excellent point, is that in a time where many things are politicized, small cell deployment has, by and large and almost overwhelmingly, been bipartisan, signed by governors of both sides, passed by aisles of both sides. And I hope that in Pennsylvania, that will be the same case as well. Thank you for the question.
Very good. Thank you very much. Well, Ms. Cooley, Mr. Chang, Ms. Shook, and to all of the representatives of the providers, I want to thank you for being here today. Appreciate your testimony and your willingness to answer our questions. And I'd now like to welcome our second panel. Our second panel includes Ronald Grutza, who is the Senior Director of Regulatory Affairs and Assistant Director of Government Affairs at the Pennsylvania State Association of Boroughs, Joe Gertis, who is the Director of Government Relations at Pennsylvania State Association of Township Supervisors, and Amy Sturgis, who is the Director of Governmental Affairs with the Pennsylvania Municipal League. And when you are ready, if you could please proceed, we would appreciate it.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Chairman Kane and members of the Senate Communications and Technology Committee. As Chair Phillips-Hill said, my name is Ron Grutza, and I serve as the Senior Director of Regulatory Affairs at the Pennsylvania State Association of Boroughs. And just want to thank you for the invitation to testify today before the committee on the expansion of 5G technology through small cell wireless deployment. PSAB, as a statewide, nonpartisan, nonprofit association dedicated to serving over 900 borough communities and thousands of elected and appointed officials throughout Pennsylvania. We've been around since 1911, representing the interests of our boroughs. Our boroughs are home to about 2.6 million Pennsylvanians. With the growth of the need for wireless internet connections, as we've heard of already, wireless phone and internet providers are gearing up to meet the growing digital needs of Pennsylvanians. Due to that increased demand, not only in streaming services, but also all of the great gadgets that are in the average household which rely on internet, new technologies are necessary to meet this ever-growing demand. The 5G technology represents that conduit to meeting the growing need for much of Pennsylvania. Unlike traditional cell towers, 5G technology requires thousands of small cell wireless facilities to be installed, often in neighborhoods and downtown areas. These small cell structures can be co-located on existing structures or on a new pole, most often in the public right-of-ways, which is land owned by local governments and essentially the taxpayers. When a wireless provider seeks to deploy these small cell structures, they must first seek application with the municipality for conformance with any land use zoning ordinances, if there are any. And most often, where this deployment is, there is zoning ordinances. In 2018, the Federal Communications Commission issued a declaratory ruling in third order report and order, which basically had the intent of streamlining the process of the deployment of 5G with small cell deployment. The order established a shot clock for deadlines for quicker application decisions by municipalities, capped application fees, capped recurring annual fees for the use of the public rights-of-way, and placed limits on aesthetic requirements. We believe the FCC order was a good first step in providing the uniformity that the industry needs to deploy 5G technology without unnecessary delays. However, the FCC order did not, and we believe could not, under the Federal Telecommunications Act, preempt local zoning for small cell structures. Land use laws are the domain of state legislatures. In the past few sessions, PSAB has engaged in the debate over the state legislation regulating small cell wireless deployment. Our members strongly opposed the overly broad preemption language in previous versions of the small cell bills. Additionally, our members objected to the caps on fees that undercut the FCC order and would not really allow for the recovery of actual costs for the management of public rights-of-ways, which would then be borne by the taxpayers. While our members stress the importance of the process of local decision-making, we certainly are willing to work with the wireless industry and have done that to provide for a fair and streamlined process for the deployment of 5G small cells in Pennsylvania. And PSAB fully supports the development of new technologies such as 5G that'll bring faster and more reliable internet services to our residents. We stand ready to work with the General Assembly and the committee and the various stakeholders on the issue of the deployment of 5G throughout Pennsylvania. And as we go through the legislative process, just about 3 points that are important for our members. And that certainly is respecting the local zoning process. Certainly, we do not want to see what was in the previous versions, which is total preemption of local zoning. We think that certainly it is part of the process, albeit if you have a standard process that provides predictability for the industry, we certainly understand that. Number two, we suggest keeping the FCC fee limits and codifying them. That would be on the caps on application fees, the annual rights-of-way fees, and additionally allow, if a municipality's costs, true costs, were over those caps, somehow to be able to recover those if they were able to prove that the costs were over the cap. And certainly encouraging co-location. You know, it's if a wireless provider could, instead of constructing a new pole, co-locate on streetlights or traffic lights, we think that would be better and faster for the deployment. So in closing, PSAB would like to thank the committee and the various stakeholders today. Certainly, I've learned a lot, and I hope as we move forward with the development of 5G, we stand ready to work with the General Assembly and all the stakeholders to advance the next level of telecommunications in the Commonwealth. We strongly believe this can be achieved in a fair and balanced manner to all parties. And when everyone's finished, I'll be happy to answer any questions that the committee may have. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Grutza. Mr. Gertis, Director of Government Relations at the Pennsylvania State Association of Township Supervisors, more widely known here in Harrisburg as PSATs.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. Chairman Kane, members of the committee, good afternoon. As the Senator just said, my name is Joe Gertis. I'm the Director of Government Relations here at the Pennsylvania State Association of Township Supervisors. Thank you for the opportunity to appear before you today on behalf of our member townships. Our association represents Pennsylvania's 1,454 townships of the second class and is committed to preserving and strengthening township government and securing greater visibility and involvement for our townships in the state and federal political arenas. Townships of the second class cover over 95% of Pennsylvania's landmass and represent more residents, 5.5 million Pennsylvanians, more than any other political subdivision in the Commonwealth. Over the last 3 sessions, PSATS has been working with legislators in the industry to craft compromise language for small wireless facilities. We feel the legislation has come a long way from the original small wireless proposals, which would have drastically limited the ability of municipalities to reasonably regulate small wireless facilities. In fact, legislation from the 2017-2018 session would have eliminated municipal zoning authority over the placement of most, if not all, wireless facilities, including large tower and guide wired monopoles, both within and outside the right-of-way. While we found the early version of the legislation to be unacceptable, we felt that it was critical to have a seat at the table to represent townships and discuss our concerns and member needs with these proposals. We recognize that the expansion of broadband to our communities is a critical need, and in fact, it's a priority for our association. However, we believe that it needs to be done in an orderly and safe fashion, and that these small cells must comply with right-of-way management ordinances and zoning provisions. As such, we have remained at the table and we have argued for many changes, quite a few of which have been made. For example, we ask that small cells comply with restrictions in place in underground utility districts. Another suggestion was to remove language that would have allowed a provider to go higher than the 50-foot limitation simply by filing a waiver with the application. In the current draft, if co-location is not an option, a provider may request a waiver to install a new utility pole greater than 50 feet, subject to applicable codes, including zoning regulations. We had requested that right-of-way fees be higher in comparison to other municipal fees, and this change was also accepted. Our position on this issue is set by our membership, which has established several policies on small wireless facilities, management of rights-of-way, and fees. Our members are very concerned that they be able to continue to exercise reasonable oversight of their right-of-way from a safety perspective and be able to negotiate for and collect reasonable fees for co-location of wireless facilities on municipal infrastructure. We also understand that any legislation, as well as any rules or fees that our members have, must comply with the Federal Communication Commission's orders. We believe that the current draft proposal meets our members' concern and is the most municipal-friendly version of small cell legislation that we have seen yet. It even improves on the 2019 legislation. For example, municipalities would have the ability to develop reasonable design guidelines to minimize aesthetic impact and would accommodate concerns while allowing rollout to continue. We must point out that the rollout of small wireless is to fill a desire for faster and more reliable broadband service. It is being rolled out to populated areas of the state, primarily suburban and urban areas, which are struggling with proliferation of wired and wireless facilities and are attempting to do their best to manage the right-of-way. In contrast, we have not seen applications for small wireless facilities in more rural areas that are unserved or underserved by broadband. Those areas would greet these facilities with open arms, of course. As the pandemic has shown, broadband is an essential service, and we must continue to work together to bridge this digital divide. We believe that township government is a critical partner in these efforts, as local officials are aware of where broadband is available and where it is sorely lacking in those communities. thank you again for the opportunity to comment today, and I'd be happy to answer any questions at the end of this panel. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Gertis. And I'd like to welcome Ms. Sturgis, who is the Director of Governmental Affairs with the Pennsylvania Municipal League.
Thank you, Madam Chair, Chairman Kane, members of the committee. I am Amy Sturgis, the Director of Governmental Affairs for the Municipal League. I also represent the State Association of Township Commissioners. We represent together nearly 200 full-service urban and suburban communities, cities, boroughs, and townships. The expanded deployment of small cell facilities in the municipal right-of-way has been a legislative priority for the League and PSATC for over the last 3 sessions. In particular, we have been concerned with balancing the growing need for this technology with local control and decision-making authority. We do not argue the benefits of deploying small cell facilities in our communities and across our Commonwealth. However, we do want to make sure that deployment is done responsibly and within the local parameters, as local governments are responsible for the health, safety, and welfare of their residents. One tool of particular importance to us is local zoning. Municipalities take their zoning authority very seriously. Therefore, legislation proposing to preempt local zoning, as has been the case in prior proposals, has not been regarded favorably. In 2018, the FCC order came down and provided a set of rules for local governments across the nation, and it gave the wireless industry a set of rules that helped to remove barriers and to foster quick, reliable installation of small cell facilities. For example, the order limits local government decision-making in the area of fees and sets specific timeframes for processing and approving facilities. Throughout the several sessions of debate on Pennsylvania-specific legislation, we've contended that the FCC order, with the FCC order in place, that additional legislation was not necessary. But however, if Pennsylvania-specific legislation must move forward, that we needed it to be as close to the FCC order as possible and not to preempt local zoning. Today, we believe that the compromise we have reached with the wireless industry over the last several months meets our goals. Both sides have conceded elements in order to get to this municipal-friendly compromise. It's important to be aware that these are technical issues, and changes to the language could easily upset the agreement, causing opposition from either side. We respectfully request that the language remain intact and that the issues outside the scope of the deployment of small cell facilities in the public right-of-way be dealt with in separate legislation. We want to thank the wireless industry for working with us outside of the legislative process to find a compromise. And we also want to thank the House and Senate legislative staff that have worked on this issue for years with us. It's a complicated issue, and they have done their best to try to make a compromise happen. So we want to appreciate them and thank them for their efforts. As long as this compromise remains intact and legislation can move forward, we fully intend to educate our members and help them to prepare for enactment. I thank you again for the opportunity to testify today, and I'm happy to answer any questions.
Thank you very much, Ms. Sturgis. And I think you answered the first question that I had, and that was, have the providers been willing to meet and make changes to their proposed legislative language? I asked them the same question. Were you willing to meet and make some of those changes? And what I'm hearing, if you could confirm this for me, is that you all have been working together and collaborating, and we seem to have found common ground. Is that your sense?
Agreed. Yes, it's been a long process, but a cordial one, and one that I think it took the sides working outside of the legislative process. No offense to the legislative process, but sometimes there's lots of forces involved that can keep things from moving forward. And the opportunity to do that outside the process helped a lot. And I think it was a good exercise.
Very good. I appreciate hearing that. Would our testifiers with the boroughs and with the townships concur with that assessment?
I would agree, Madam Chairman. The industry, as it was noted from another presentation, not everybody got what they wanted here, but we've worked very hard to iron out those places where we can agree, and the industry has worked well with all of us.
And from Borough's perspective, certainly I'll concur with Amy and Joe's assessment, and just want to thank the industry for the willingness to enter into negotiations with the various municipal associations. Everybody didn't get what 100% of what we wanted, but we think that it's a fair and balanced compromise, which will provide predictability and certainly still respects the rights of local municipalities.
Very good. Well, I was in downtown Harrisburg this morning, had a chance to get a little breakfast before we went into session today, and I was seeing small cells going up, and they seem to blend in very well with the light poles. Do you find that to be the norm for most municipalities?
Go ahead, Joe.
Thanks, Amy. I believe that from the technology standpoint, I defer to some of the industry, but I believe negotiations and things that started before I started with PSAT several years ago. I think the technology has changed as technology will very quickly, and a lot of the size limitations and what have you have changed as well, and that was all part of these negotiations. So I think part of that is to blend into to the environment, but I defer to the industry on the actual technical sizing and all that.
Very good.
Joe, I'll kind of from the industry standpoint. I mean, the goal is to make them to be designed in plain sight. You don't want them looking like a sore thumb. I think it's there's the opportunity for the municipal groups to understand the above ground infrastructure in their neighborhoods and create design standards that would allow a small cell to go in there and blend in with whatever is already there.
Very good. Thank you. Chairman Kane.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you, panelists, for your comments today. I appreciate it and bringing some light to some of this new stuff that I'm starting to learn about. I really don't know too much about all this, so thank you for being patient with me with some of these questions that I have. But Mr. Grutzka, in your testimony, you discussed the importance of co-locating 5G small cells on existing streetlights and traffic signals. What are the benefits of co-locating to the borough?
Oh, thank you, Chairman Kane. That's a good question. What we believe and why we would stress the benefits of co-locating on those structures is that it would just cut down on the construction of new poles or new towers. And it has the added benefit then of, obviously subject to the needs of what the pattern that the industry needs, but it would certainly, from our perspective, speed up that process of deployment.
Thank you. I have a question for Mr. Gerdes. In your testimony, you state that the PSAT has not seen application for small wireless facilities in more rural areas that are unserved and underserved by broadband. What can we do in this legislation to increase application for small wireless facilities applications and to ensure 5G deployment in more rural areas?
Well, again, I think, really that's a question for the industry to answer. I think Dave Kerr touched on it briefly, that, a lot of this build out right now is going to be in the more populated areas. As that build out continues, I'm assuming that the more rural areas this technology would be available. Our concern is to help, as you mentioned, to help foster the number of facilities out in those rural areas. But really, we just have to work hand in hand with the industry to accomplish that.
Thank you. And to Ms. Sturgis, in your testimony, you request that issues outside the scope of deployment of small cell facilities in the public right-of-way be dealt with the separate legislation. What issues do you anticipate will arise from the fallout from the outside, or I should say, from the fall outside the scope of deployment of small cells in the public right-of-way? Sorry, my glasses are fogging up.
Well, in past iterations of the legislation, there's been issues related to the deployment of broadband itself and also worker-related issues. And so I think these, while they may be perfectly valid issues that need to be addressed, I don't know that this is the place for them, and that they could cause the legislation to not move forward as easily as it has the potential to.
Thank you. I have no further questions.
Thank you, Chairman Kane. And I'd like to thank Mr. Grutza, Mr. Gertis, Ms. Sturgis. Thank you for your testimony today. It was really helpful. And I want to thank all of today's testifiers for your input. Our second part of this hearing will be on May 10th at 10:30 in the morning here in the Senate chamber and on Zoom. And I now recess the Senate Communications and Technology Committee until the call of the chair.